All right, so in lecture 3, we talked about the basics of the nervous system and neuroanatomy, and now we're going to dive into a division of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. And we decided to place an entire lecture focused on this is because this is a very high yield topic for anatomy, also for neuroanatomy as well, but especially for anatomy. These structures and these functions and these concepts are going to come up in every single chapter in this book, and so we really want you to have a solid understanding of the autonomic nervous system going forward. So to start us out, we got an overview. It's, again, as I've mentioned in the previous lecture, it's an involuntary. So none of this is voluntarily controlled. This is all going on inside of each and every one of us without us even really knowing it or necessarily being aware of it. So it's really what's keeping us alive. It regulates the homeostasis, and it has that efferent and afferent innervation to visceral organs. Now, what we're going to talk about a lot is the two divisions of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, there's a third one that's called the enteric nervous system, and we won't talk about that too much we won't really talk about that in this lecture. That's specific to the GI tract, so that's something we're going to talk about more so in detail in the abdomen chapter, but just to mention it so you're aware that there's also a third division as well. This is something that's not really as well understood as the other two major divisions. So you got the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, these act on all these organs. So this is the diagram. So you have fibers from the red, which are the sympathetic nervous system, and then you have the blue fibers, which are the parasympathetic nervous system, and they act on the same organ. So each organ receives both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. So you have the SNS and the PNS. So if you have the heart, let's say you have the heart here, okay? The sympathetic nervous system is going to provide innervation to the heart. So is the parasympathetic nervous system, and they act in opposition to each other. So one set of effects will be as a result of the SNS, and then another set of results will be from the PNS. And in this specific case, the sympathetic nervous system increases your heart rate. So if you get scared and startled, your heart rate goes up, and that's because of the sympathetic nervous system. And the idea of that is to give you a higher heart rate so that you can run away faster and protect yourself. Parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. It actually decreases your heart rate because it's more of a resting state. So if you're resting and maybe even just had a meal, the common term is rest and digest. You don't need a super high heart rate, so you can decrease your heart rate. And that's just one example of how these systems operate in opposition to each other. Now, autonomic pathways, they consist of two neurons and two synapses. That's the basic structure. So you have the presynaptic neuron, and so we'll draw this in here. So here's your primary neuron. So this is a signal for primary. Here's its axon coming out here, and then these dash structures will represent the neuron terminal of that neuron. And then you have the secondary neuron here. So this is your secondary neuron. Now, this is also called your presynaptic neuron, pre-ganglionic, and we'll explain why that. And then your secondary neuron would be your post-synaptic or post-ganglionic. And then this is going to go out here, and this will synapse on your target tissue out here. So this is your target tissue. So just so you fully understand this. So you have your presynaptic neuron here, or pre-ganglionic. And then so these cell bodies here are located, this is in the CNS. Now, once we left the CNS, now we're in the PNS, okay? So we'll draw this in here. So here's your cell bodies right here, okay? This is your CNS, okay? This is your primary neuron or presynaptic neuron. And then here it's leaving out here. Now it's in the PNS, okay? Now, the synapses only occur. So this here is a synapse, okay? So you have one neuron stimulating another neuron. That's a synapse. These are only with postsynaptic autonomic neurons. So an autonomic primary neuron or presynaptic neuron is not going to synapse with a somatic neuron that's innervating a skeletal muscle. It's only going to innervate with other autonomic neurons. And sympathetic neurons are only going to synapse with sympathetic neurons. Parasympathetic neurons are only going to synapse with parasympathetic neurons. There's no crossing of signals. Now, an important exception to that is with the adrenal gland, and we'll talk about this more in the abdomen lecture, but just so you're aware of it. So you got the adrenal gland here. The adrenal gland is a little triangular shaped gland like this, and it sits on top of the kidney like this. So you got your kidney like this. And so you have your primary neurons here. What they do is they come in, and you have these cells, these special cells within your adrenal gland. So the neurons come in, the sympathetic neurons come in, and they synapse on these cells. So they're not, these cells are not neurons. They're specialized cells that produce hormones, epinephrine or adrenaline, and noradrenaline or norepinephrine, and these are what are part of your stress response. So this is a unique example, and I'm mentioning it here because it's also a very high yield topic that we'll talk about more in the abdomen lecture. But again, so you have your primary neuron, your presynaptic neuron comes in and synapses on the cells within the adrenal gland to release their hormones directly into the bloodstream. So there's no secondary neuron or postsynaptic neuron in this case. But otherwise, everything else, you got a presynaptic neuron, a synapse, and then a postsynaptic neuron. Now, what's important is these synapses usually occur in ganglion. So ganglion, as we talked about in the last lecture, they house cell bodies in them. So here you go. Here's your cell body right here, your postsynaptic neuron. So your postsynaptic neuron has its cell body in the ganglion. The other thing a ganglion hosts is the synapses as well. Okay. So again, here we say it's located in ganglion throughout the body, and then again, so the synapse of the postganglionic neuron is in the target tissue as well. So it's going to synapse right on the tissue, directly on the tissue, not onto another neuron. Similar to this, to the adrenal gland. So these are ganglion here: celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglion, inferior mesenteric ganglion. These are ganglion where a lot of synapses will occur. It's not where all synapses occur, but these are three big examples of autonomic ganglion where synapses will occur. So you'll have your pre come in and your post come out. Now let's talk about the different classes of neurons. So we included, even though somatic isn't considered part of the autonomic nervous system, we have it in here just for comparison. So we want to talk about, again, this is such a high yield thing, is where the cell bodies are located, where what neurotransmitter is used. This is important for anatomy, very important for anatomy. But it's also, I'd say it's also important for if you're taking a physiology course along with this. Many schools now are doing anatomy and physiology together, along with pathology. It's also important to know that neurotransmitters, so this is more of a physiology, what type of receptor is going on, and then what type of neurotransmitter again, and then what type of receptor in the second synapse. So let's get to it. So we got the somatic nervous system first. So here's your cross section of the spinal cord. So here's your ventral horn, okay? And this is where your somatic is, okay? So here's where somatic is. And the somatic, as we talked about in the last lecture, these are going to come out like this, and they're going to synapse directly onto the neuromuscular junction, okay? Neuromuscular junction. You got your skeletal muscle like this, directly on. It's acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, nicotinic receptor. There's no second neuron in the somatic nervous system. It's just a single neuron coming out here. So there's no second neurotransmitter and no second receptor. Now, let's get into the autonomic nervous system. So this is the ANS. Boom. So the sympathetic nervous system. You have the lateral horn here. This is the lateral horn. So this is where all sympathetic cell bodies are located. Okay, sympathetic straightforward. So these are going to come out again like this, and then they're going to synapse like this. So you're going to have the synapsing here on another cell body. So this is in a ganglion, like we showed. Now here's a ganglion, here's a ganglion, celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric. Could be one of these, could be a different ganglion than these. Just to give you an example. So it's going to come in, primary neuron, it's going to synapse in the ganglion. You have your second or postsynaptic neuron cell body here in the ganglion. Then the axon leaves. So the neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine, okay? So that's important to know. One thing if you'll notice here is they're all acetylcholine. So first synapse, easy to remember. Doesn't matter somatic, sympathetic, parasympathetic, it's always acetylcholine, okay? And then with that, it's always the same receptor. It's the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. So every first synapse is acetylcholine going into a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, okay? Now, let's get into the secondary synapse, okay? Now, the secondary synapse is always on the tissue itself, okay? So the secondary synapse is going to be here, and then you're on the tissue, okay? So we're still talking about the SNS here, okay? That's on the tissue, okay? Now, that is going to be a different neurotransmitter. That's going to be norepinephrine, which is also commonly known as adrenaline. and then it's going to act on, it could act on either the alpha or the beta receptors. Now, for anatomy, that's not really important. Just maybe be aware of it. If it's for physiology, the physiology books and lectures are going to go to town on this stuff. So if you want more detail on that, that's where I would go for that. Otherwise, just putting this in here to make you aware of it. Now, let's go to the PNS. It's also referred to as craniosacral division. Now, the reason for that is that the cell bodies are either located in the brainstem up here, so here the brainstem, or the lateral horn. And the only place they're located in the lateral horn is down here in the sacral region. Okay, so let's talk about first the brainstem. So the brainstem, you can actually see them here. You have the cell bodies here, and then they travel down in here, and then they form a synapse in the target tissue. So if we do a PNS here, let's do a little diagram here. So we got the brainstem here, BS, brainstem, and you have your cell body here, and then the axon comes out like that. It's going to come down and it's going to synapse within the wall of the organ. So whatever organ this is acting on, the neuron, the axon is going to come into and then synapse within the wall of the organ. So the ganglion, even though they're ganglion, they're not really named. We don't know what they are because they're within the walls of the organ. So it's within the tissue. So parasympathetic neurons, primary neurons, they synapse within the walls of the organ. That's where the primary first synapse is. Okay. And again, this is acetylcholine, like we talked about, and then it's nicotinic receptors. And then they're going to have short postganglionic axons. So a thing to remember here is that the parasympathetic nervous system, it has long presynaptic neurons and then short postsynaptic axons. Okay, and then these are going to synapse directly on the tissue, so no neuron. Okay, and these will synapse on. This secondary synapse will be acetylcholine, which is different. So this is a difference to be aware of. So the second synapse neurotransmitter for sympathetic nervous system is norepinephrine, versus the parasympathetic nervous system, the second synapse neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And now for physiology, it's going to be different receptor, muscarinic receptors. Okay, and there's like 4 classes of those. There's M1, M2, M3. Again, the physiology books will go to town on that. We won't get into that. So, just to review here, let's go to a whiteboard, okay? So, you have the sympathetic nervous system, okay? The preganglionic neurons, okay? So, the preganglionic neurons, these are short, okay? Versus, so there's a saying, it's called para, long, pre, okay? And this is a good thing to write down, so that you can remember. So the reason they're referring to the presynaptic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system. So PNS, the preganglionic neurons are very long, okay? Then they synapse in the tissue, okay? Like this. Then their postganglionic axons or neurons are very short, okay? So you see this is long, this is short, because the preganglionic neuron, it's got to go all the way to the target. It can't stop at It can't stop and hang out at a ganglion on the way there. It's got to go all the way there. Versus the sympathetic nervous system. So we'll draw a line here. You've got a preganglionic neuron here. These are shorter, okay, because it can stop off in a ganglion. It's not as long distance, okay. So then you got a ganglion here, okay, somewhere out in the body, either around the aorta. It could be anywhere around other organs as well. And then the postganglionic is not short. So the postganglionic comes out, and then it travels all the way to a tissue, okay, to an organ, and then it synapses in an organ, okay? And remember, these synapses, so this synapse within the tissue, this synapse within the ganglion, both are acetylcholine, both are nicotinic receptors, okay? And then the postganglionic in the sympathetic nervous system is norepinephrine. Now, a way you can remember that is the sympathetic nervous system is the stress response. So like when you're stressed or you're freaked out or you're scared and you're trying to run away, this is norepinephrine. You hear the expression, you got your adrenaline going. Like you're going to a test, you got your adrenaline going. You're working out. Norepinephrine is the common term for that is noradrenaline. Okay, so that's a way you could keep it straight. And then in the PNS, the postganglionic synapse is acetylcholine. Okay, so and then again acetylcholine. So again, parasympathetic, both of them are acetylcholine. different receptors though. So this is muscarinic if you're doing physiology. So I hope that helps. I just wanted to go into a little more detail here and review this just so you had all these terms straight. I kind of threw a lot at you at once. So could help you to go through this part of the video again one more time if you're still unsure. Now, we talked a lot about ganglion in the previous slide. We'll just have a little slide here to cover it, go into a little more detail. So ganglions, they contain one thing. So if you use your ganglion, they can either contain a cell body, which is going out here with its axon, or it can contain a synapse. So you got a neuron out here coming in, synapsing, the other one out. So you got cell bodies and synapses. And ganglion is not specific to the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system, okay? You can, it goes both ways. So then there's sensory so then these are autonomic, and then there's sensory ganglion, which for example are that dorsal root ganglion that we talked about with the spinal, when we were talking about the spinal nerve anatomy. And these contain only sensory neurons, and no synapses occurring within them. So sensory ganglion are a little unique. You have this sensory like this with cell body. So we'll blow this up here. So here's the DRG, okay? You have your cell body in here, and it's coming out like this. So one part is going into the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord, and this is the other part that is out from the peripheral. So the signal comes in like this. It goes up into the cell body, and then it can keep going, okay? So that's the difference between the sensory ganglion and remember, this dorsal root ganglion can contain autonomic sensory fibers, then it can also carry somatic sensory fibers. So there's both cell body types in here. All right, so now we'll talk about the sympathetic nervous system and its pathways. So the overall function, again, as I've alluded to before, is the fight or flight response. And now what does that mean? Is it's priming the body for intensive physical activity. So you're going to increase blood flow to muscles, to skeletal muscle, so you can run away. You're going to increase your heart rate so you can run away. You're going to increase the release of cortisol, which is a stress hormone that increases glucose in the blood. So you have plenty of energy to run away. And it's going to decrease blood flow to the GI tract. And because in the time of high activity, metabolizing, or having the GI tract running isn't exactly a high priority. Now, it's also called the thoracolumbar division, and the reason for that is because the cell bodies are located the cell bodies of the presynaptic neurons are located in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, in the gray matter in the segments of T1 to L2, only in here, so only in thoracic and lumbar sections of the spinal cord. Cranial sacral is the parasympathetic, so just this is SNS, and then PNS is these two here. Okay. Now the first synapse occurs in one of two places. So you've got your cell bodies here. These are the cell bodies of your presynaptic neuron. Okay. Now they're going to happen in one of two places. One, they're going to either happen in this structure here called the sympathetic trunk. Now what is the sympathetic trunk? The sympathetic trunk is a long neurostructure, and it's on either side. It's on either side of the spinal cord, and it runs on the anterior surface of the vertebrae of the spinal column. And what happens is the neurons come out here, and they can synapse in the sympathetic trunk. Now these are only sympathetic neurons, nothing else. And they synapse in here, and this can be the primary. And then the postsynaptic neurons come from here, and they go to their target organ. The other place they can synapse is the pre-vertebral ganglion, which are these three ganglion right here: celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. So this is the other place, the pre-vertebral. Now, what's important to know is the sympathetic trunk can be also called the paravertebral ganglion because it's just next to the vertebrae, or where the vertebral column, where the spinal cord is. And then pre-vertebral is because it's thought of as, this is just a diagram, but it would be kind of anterior to or in front of the spinal column. So those are the two places where the cell bodies of postsynaptic neurons are located. So, test question: if a test asks you about a sympathetic neuron and asks you where's the cell body, it's going to be in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, T1 through L2 level. If they ask you where's the cell bodies of the postsynaptic neurons, one of two places. Again, sympathetic trunk or the prevertebral ganglion. Okay? always want to be making a note, highlighting in your book the locations of these cell bodies, okay? And sympathetic trunk can also be sympathetic chain ganglion. There's a bunch of different names, but we'll refer to it usually as the sympathetic trunk. Now, the sympathetic nervous system, what does it do? It innervates all the organs of the body. It innervates the blood vessels, smooth muscle, sweat glands, erector pili muscles, which are help elevate the hair throughout the skin. The autonomic nervous system affects the lumen of the blood vessel. Now, the sympathetic nervous system does not always dilate. It does not always constrict. It depends what organ it's acting in. So you have that smooth muscle layer around an artery, and so that can constrict and limit blood flow. So if you want to, like, if you're running away and you want to limit blood flow to the GI tract, the sympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate these muscles these smooth muscle cells to constrict, so that in the GI tract to limit blood flow. Versus skeletal muscle, they're not going to constrict because you want as much blood flow as possible to the skeletal muscle so you can run away. Now, let's talk about the pathways here. This is important stuff. This is topics you can get very frequently tested on both class exams and maybe even on a board exam. Not necessarily the specific pathway, but definitely locations of cell bodies where synapses occur, things like that. So let's go through this diagram here. So you have your spinal cord here. This is your ventral horn. This is your ventral root. This is your spinal nerve. Okay, this is your dorsal ramus. And this is your ventral ramus, okay? Now, this is your sympathetic chain, or your sympathetic trunk, okay? Now, this is the white rami, the white ramus. And this is the gray ramus, okay? Now, let's talk about these. So that's just horrible handwriting. So that's white, excuse that, white ramus, gray ramus, okay? So gray rami, they exist at all spinal levels, okay? So cervical all the way through sacral, there's always a gray rami. And what's traveling through every gray rami is a it's key here, postsynaptic fiber. Always, if someone asks you on an exam what type of neuron is traveling through here and it's pointing to a gray or it's talking about a gray ramus, it is always a postsynaptic fiber, sympathetic postsynaptic fiber, okay? Now, the white rami is the T1 through L2 spinal levels. So there's only white rami located at those levels, and they connect the ventral rami to the sympathetic chain, okay? So let's talk about the pathway. So now that we know what the structures are, let's talk about the pathway. So you got a cell body here of a neuron, sympathetic neuron. It comes through the ventral root. This is your presynaptic neuron, okay? It's going to come through here, goes in through the white. So the white rami, it's always going in, okay? It's always going into the sympathetic ganglion or the sympathetic trunk, okay? It's never going out that way. Now, and then gray, it's always coming out of. So a way you can remember that is goes in clean, meaning white, because white is usually synonymous with clean, comes out dirty, okay, which would be gray, okay? So comes in clean, goes out dirty, okay? Comes out dirty. So that's how you remember the white versus gray. So what happens is we'll have a synapse here, and we'll go through these pathways a little bit. So here's a cell body here. You have a postsynaptic neuron, comes out here, re-enters the spinal nerve. So it synapses in the sympathetic trunk, and then it comes back and re-enters the spinal nerve. And then it can exit either through the dorsal and go innervate the skin of the back or other structures, or it can go through the ventral ramus and go through and innervate organs throughout the body. Now, let's talk about this sympathetic trunk. So, again, this is the spinal cord. This is your dorsal ventral root. This is your DRG, dorsal root ganglion. This is your sympathetic chain. So, these bulbs here, these circles, represent the different ganglion along. It's like a string of ganglion, or like a string of beads, if you've seen like a string of beads. And you can think of that as like with the sympathetic chain. If you dissected a cadaver and you go down to the vertebral column, you'll actually see it. You'll see these little beads of ganglion. And they're connected by these structures that connect them so that neurons can travel between the different ganglion. So what we'll go through here is the different primary, presynaptic and postsynaptic pathways that are possible, okay? And so what happens here is so let's draw our primary. So our primary, this is our presynaptic neuron, okay? And so that's going to go through the ventral root, and then it's going to go through the spinal nerve, it's going to go in through the white, and then it's going to synapse here, okay? And then it's going to synapse in there, and that's one thing it can do. Now, it has a couple options when it comes into the white ramus, okay? It can synapse here, and then the postsynaptic is going to exit out and go on and do its thing. The other thing it can do is, so if we go down here, let's do a new thing here, clean it up. So we can have it go down, come down here, and then it goes in through the ventral root again, spinal nerve, then the white rami, and then it does not synapse, so no synapse. This is one option it can do, okay? Instead, it ascends. It can either go down or ascend. Since we only got two here in the diagram, we'll show it ascending, but it could go down. And it can ascend. It could stop here, or it could keep going. It doesn't necessarily have to be the next one. And then here, it synapses on its postsynaptic neuron, and then that neuron goes out and exits. Okay, so that's another option, ascending or descending. Now, the third option for a presynaptic sympathetic neuron, traveling in the sympathetic trunk, is it can also go onto the pre-vertebral ganglion. And so we're jumping a little bit ahead here, and we've mentioned these. So you have these ganglion that run along the aorta, and they're especially in the abdomen, and they innervate structures in the abdomen. They provide autonomic innervation to structures in the abdomen. So what you have here is you have your presynaptic neuron. So here's your pre, okay, cell body here, and then it goes through the ventral root, into the spinal nerve, into the white ramus, then it goes into the sympathetic chain, or sympathetic trunk. Now, what we didn't show you here is there's these structures called splanchnic nerves, okay? And these are all along the sympathetic trunk. And what they do is they're nerves that come right off of the ganglion, okay? So they're it's another option for the presynaptic neuron to exit the sympathetic trunk. So what it does is it goes through no synapse in the sympathetic trunk, okay? And then it travels through the splanchnic nerve to the prevertebral ganglion. Then here, it can synapse, and then the postsynaptic neuron will go to the target organ, okay? So that's the third option. All right, so now that we've talked about the pathways of the presynaptic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system, now we're going to talk about the options or the pathways for the postsynaptic. So let's start again with the pre. Can't have a post without a pre. So the presynaptic neuron, it comes through here, ventral root, spinal nerve, into the white ramus, into the sympathetic chain. Now, what can it do here? First option, it can synapse here in the sympathetic chain, and then it can exit out through the gray ramus back into the spinal nerve, and then enter, and then go this way. Now, this is, again, it doesn't matter if the presynaptic neuron synapsed at the same level, or if it came up, from this way and synapsed and then exit. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to. The presynaptic neuron doesn't have to be from the same level as the postsynaptic neuron when it exits. Okay. Second and third options. So we got second here. So we'll start with our presynaptic neuron. It goes in the ventral root, spinal nerve, white ramus. Synapses here. Now remember those splanchnic nerves we were talking about that branch directly off the sympathetic trunk? So splanchnic nerve. Though they can exit directly out and go this way, so they can not even bother with the gray ramus and re-entering the spinal nerve. They can just go right off the sympathetic trunk into the splanchnic nerve and go on and affect their target organ. So that's the second option. Third option. So let's have our cell body here for our pre. Comes in ventral root, goes in the spinal nerve, comes into the sympathetic trunk here, synapses. Now the post, this is the third option. So we have there's blood vessels that have these structures that are called perivascular plexus, okay, or plexuses or plexi. So they're just these collection of nerves and ganglion around blood vessels that then travel to a target organ, okay? So what happens is these postsynaptic, they just kind of branch These are usually close by anatomically. They just branch off via nerve structures and travel in these plexuses along the blood vessel to innervate the resulting organ. Okay, so that's the third option. Now let's talk about these pre-vertebral ganglion. Okay, so we'll start again with the pre. So you probably get the idea right by now. Ventral root, spinal nerve, then it goes into the white ramus. Now let's draw that splanchnic nerve in again. So we got the splanchnic nerve. Now, no synapse goes on here in the sympathetic trunk. There's going to be a synapse later on. So we go into this, and this would be the celiac ganglion. So what are the prevertebral ganglion? So right here. So they're ganglion that are located usually around major branches off of the aorta. So celiac trunk is a major branch in the abdomen, superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery. These are arteries that supply the GI tract. Now, near these are arteries coming off the abdominal aorta. Now, what you have here is these, represented by these gray circles, is ganglion that are correspond. So you have the celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglion, inferior mesenteric ganglion, and then there's also like an aortic renal ganglion. We won't get into all the ganglion. The idea is that there's these collections of ganglion that are near vessels coming off the aorta, and they house autonomic fibers innervating organs in the area. So what happens here? So it can come in, and then it can synapse directly on in its secondary neuron or postsynaptic neuron. Then the neuron leaves, goes through a nerve, and affects the target organ. Okay, so that's one option. Now, a second option here is that the fiber. So let's draw a new one here, new pre here. Okay, it can come off the ventral root, spinal nerve, white ramus. Again, no synapse going on here. So let's say it goes through this splanchnic nerve. So this is also a splanchnic nerve. As it goes through the splanchnic nerve. Now, let's say it gets to this ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion. It doesn't have to synapse here. It can keep on going. It goes around the artery, goes into the inferior mesenteric ganglion, synapse is there, and then the postsynaptic goes in here and goes in synapses on the target organ. Okay? Now, one thing to be aware of is it can pass through one ganglion. You could have a fiber, neuron fiber that passes through all three of these and then synapses here and then goes on. Okay? So it doesn't, there's no limit here. It's not like it has to go into the first ganglion it encounters, the second, or even the third. It can keep going. And to finish things off here, we're going to talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. So its overall function is to restore the body and conserve energy. So hence the saying, rest and digest. And so what is this including? Decrease blood pressure, so you don't need to have an upbeat, heart rate. Decrease the blood flow to skeletal muscle because it's not as important to get moving. And really what it does is increases blood flow to the GI tract. And the reason for that is so you can increase absorption of nutrients. Other things that on the biochemistry level, it stimulates anabolic processes as well, because you want to build up protein, you want to build up glycogen stores so that the next time a stress reaction occurs, you have enough energy to do so. It's also known as the craniosacral division, and this is because of where the two locations cell bodies are found. One in the brainstem and one in the lateral horn of the gray matter in the sacral spinal cord segment. So we'll show on the diagram here. Here's the brainstem. Parasympathetics are shown in blue. The sympathetic are shown in red. So you can see here, here's the two divisions, the cranial sacral divisions. And one thing to note is that the cell bodies for the spinal cord, they're only in the parasympathetic. They're only found in the sacral section of the spinal cord, nowhere else. Not in if you're in the thoracic or lumbar section, those are sympathetic neurons. Another thing to note, it does not innervate the body wall, the extremities, nor the peripheral blood vessels. So we'll talk about the pathways. It's similar again, like we've talked about pre and post ganglionic neurons. But the first synapse, it occurs in autonomic ganglion that are located near or within the wall of the target organ. So if this is your target organ, the ganglion's either going to be right outside the wall or it's going to be inside the wall of the tissue, and then the neuron will come in, synapse, and then the postganglionic is a very short neuron within the tissue wall, which synapses directly onto the target tissue. So that's where the second synapse occurs. The cell bodies of the postsynaptic neurons are located in these ganglions, so either just near the wall of the organ or within the wall. Now, the first of the three sets of pathways we're going to talk about are the ones that occur in the head. Now, these are sort of unique because they involve ganglion that are associated with specific cranial nerves, because the cranial nerves have, as you remember us talking about, they have multiple different neuron fibers traveling through them, and one of them is actually parasympathetic. And so this is one exception where the ganglion are not necessarily found in the wall of the target tissue. So here you have the ciliary ganglion as an example. These blue fibers coming in. These are the preganglionic fibers. They synapse here in the ciliary ganglion, and then the postsynaptic go on to innervate the sphincter pupillae muscles, which help regulate the diameter of the eye, regulating how much light comes into the eye. Now that's where the synapse occurs, and then the ganglion, they contain the synapses and the cell bodies of the secondary, so it's pretty standard. Then you have the visceral innervation, and this is the main player here is the vagus nerve, okay? Cranial nerve 10. And what these is responsible for is innervating viscera of the head, thorax, abdomen, and pelvis. It's a very long nerve, as you can see in the diagram here. It goes all the way down through the neck, through the thorax, through the abdomen, into the pelvis. And so one thing to note here is we'll draw a diagram here. So this is the brainstem. Then we'll draw the cell body in, and the vagus nerve comes right off of the brainstem. So it's coming off here. This is our vagus. And then as it goes through these different divisions, thorax, abdomen, and then pelvis, it's giving off branches in all these different regions. And so what these axons do is they come down and they'll follow along these branches, and then let's say you have a target organ here. It synapses in the wall of the target organ. So here's the ganglion, here's the postsynaptic neuron, and then it's this short little axon that synapses directly on the target tissue. So preganglionic starts here in the brainstem. That's where the cell body goes. The axon goes through the vagus nerve, through its branches, and then ends up in the tissue wall of the target organ, and then it synapses here. This is the postganglionic neuron, which is a very short, synapsing directly on the tissue. And lastly, we're going to talk about the sacral division of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, this occurs in the S2 through S4 spinal cord levels, and this is similar to the sympathetic nervous system in that the cell bodies are located in the lateral horn. So you have those here of the preganglionic neurons. Now, if you remember the saying para, long, pre. So long preganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, it's the same kind of thing. These are long preganglionic neurons. They travel through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve. Now in the pelvis, we have a unique structure. We have these pelvic splanchnic nerves that come right off of the spinal nerve. So the pelvic splanchnic nerves, and these go through the inferior hypogastric plexus. So we'll abbreviate that IHP, inferior hypogastric plexus. No synapse going on. So here's the fiber, comes in through the nerve, through the plexus, and then it ends up going through some more terminal plexi that are unique to each organ. So remember how we were talking about each organ oftentimes will have a plexus around, an autonomic plexus around, and just a group of ganglion and nerves. Usually goes through all of that. So you have the organ here, and then it synapses in the tissue wall of the target organ. So again, you have this short postganglionic neuron that then synapses directly on the tissue. So you have the synapse here. So again, long preganglionic neuron goes through the spinal nerve, goes into these unique pelvic splanchnic nerves, goes through the plexus, inferior hypogastric plexus, no synapse, goes through the visceral plexus right nearby, into the tissue wall, synapses, short, and then a short postganglionic neuron acting directly on the tissue. And that concludes our discussion of the autonomic nervous system.